Hello everybody and welcome back to another faction guide for Divide et Impera, the mod for Rome 2. Today we're going to be looking at the Galatians, who are by far the most brawly faction of all 20 I've looked at so far. They have very strong melee infantry, however that's essentially all they possess, as the rest of their roster is rather lacking or just lackluster. Because of this, you get the impression that you're playing as some sort of ancient Celtic Viking horde, marauding around Asia Minor, sacking and pillaging as you please. This experience is rather cool, although I would never consider Galatia amongst one of the power factions in this mod. So let's go look at the Galatians and how to get ahead in their, honestly, rather challenging campaign. Alright everybody, so for your start position, you're going to start out with one settlement in Galatia at Cappadocia. I'm sure this isn't a surprise given the name of this province. However, what is somewhat of a surprise is that your early game army is severely overpowered. As you can see, you don't even have many units to recruit. However, there's one amongst these troops that stands out entirely. And that's going to be your Galatian Naked Warriors. These guys are absurdly powerful for early game because their stats are just ungodly. Like, if you look at this unit statistically, it will outperform almost every single melee infantry in the game once you add on that, like, boost they get with this experience chevron. I mean, 15 melee attack and 17 melee defense is better than the best Roman sword in the game. 30 charge bonus, that's like a shock infantry charge. 25 weapon damage is admittedly pretty average amongst elite tiers, but still competent. A little bit of armor penetration at 6. Actually, 6 is pretty good. 6 is pretty good for armor penetration. And of course, you get insane bonus with cavalry as well. 64 base morale is also obscene. And to top it all off, this amazing unit comes with, I believe it's 3 volleys of javelins, or 4 as a base, but 5 because of the experience chevron that you get here. So that's obviously insane. And yes, they do have 8 armor, but when everything else is good, not just good, but amazing, somewhere between amazing and exceptional, this unit just becomes incredibly overpowered. And what really makes this advantage extreme is that all of the factions around you are either like Hellenic factions or they are like Eastern inspired factions. You know, 2 culture groups that are notorious for not bringing particularly good infantry in early game. So this unit will be absolutely outmatched on the battlefield here. Now, they are expensive. 204 is nothing to scoff at in terms of price. For that amount of income per turn, you can bring, like, something really good, like a hoplite, like a, pike phalanx. I think a lot of hoplites are cheaper than this to maintain per turn, actually. So this is a very expensive unit to bring, and also, I'm sure that you will notice that you don't exactly have a ton of income. See, like, this settlement is not very economically viable, but militarily it's amazing. Like, having 1,500 nobles and 4,500 second-class people on turn 1 is also incredible. Like, you don't see very many factions that give you this many warrior-class people in your, like, first settlement. So you really need to leverage that population, quickly develop a really, really good army, and find an opponent to take on. And we'll go over the virtues of which opponents to take for early on, but I'll just kind of go over a couple of things that you should also pay attention to in your early game. For technology, you start out with the first military technology research, so I would just very quickly get this, because if you upgrade this to your level 2 barrack, which will promptly be unlocked, you do unlock a lot of very, very good units right away, such as Galatian swordsmen, which will give you a really good kind of mid-class option to use. These Galatian axemen, who are a phenomenal axe unit and just give you a viable option for shock infantry that isn't as exposed as your naked spears. Your Galatian chosen swordsmen, who are an insane early game unit. This is like equivalent to a lot of late game swords in terms of power. We're better than a lot of late game swords. You guys will dumpster a 4x sword with ease. And to get them like 6 turns, well, not 6, I guess you have to wait for your barrack to build. So something like 12 turns into the game will absolutely be unmatched on the battlefield. And the rest of these, you need reforms to unlock, but you just get so many great things, so definitely do that type of research. I wouldn't really bother to develop a settlement, and I'll go over that in a little bit. But when it comes to your early game, Yeah, I would definitely recruit quite a few of these naked spears. I would probably make sure to have like 8 of them or so in your early game army if possible. The rest of your ranks, I would probably fill out with these Galatian light spearmen. Like, we are basically like a buffed barbarian levy, what is it, like levy spearmen. I mean, they have pretty good combat stats, just bad armor. It's just at the end of the day, like, you do need to save some money, so I would get these guys. They're definitely more than competent enough to go against early game Greeks and Eastern factions. Just these like naked spears will be the brunt of your killing potentials. These guys will just kind of fill out your army. You could in theory get some slingers, but I wouldn't really bother too much. Maybe Galatian skirmishers are a better option, to be honest. You do have the option of this particular really good Galatian mercenary spearmen. These are identical to the ones that Egypt gets, and I mean, they're really good. They have 27 charge bonus, only marginally less than your naked spear, but you know, they have 25 armor, so they're far more survivable. And while, yeah, they're not going to be as combat effective, but additional armor just makes them like a much more stable unit, so consider getting these guys too. Definitely a viable option. Now, when it comes to your first opponent, you really have 2 paths that you can take. One is that you could try to unify your home province, but I would actually advise against that. Like, sure, it might seem like it's common sense to just conquer the rest of your province, but there's 2 settlements here that are kind of dangerous to attack. One is Iconium. This is patrolled by Lydia, which is a satrap of the Seleucid Empire, so like, you know, at the end of the day, if you attack these guys, you're going to be at war with the Seleucids. The other one is Cide, controlled by the Ptolemaic dynasty. And they can always come and avenge their fallen settlement with like a navy or something. And it figures that once you have this entire province, you're going to share a solid border here with the Seleucids. They're just down here. This is where Syria starts. So I wouldn't really go here. Like, the Seleucid Empire isn't a very dangerous opponent to have in early game unless you share a border. And you will share a border if you take this province. So I just don't think it's worth it. While these Galatian units are good, I would be terrified of going against the full brunt of the Seleucid military, as well as just for economy. Just for economy, and also you have no real counter to their like strong cavalry and pike phalanxes. They'll just be such a difficult opponent to face, and an unnecessarily difficult opponent. Instead of going up against the Seleucids, I would just go up to Bithynia at Pontus. None of the factions here have a particularly strong alliance system that guards them. Most of these are just one and done factions, from Pontus to Sinope, Trapezoes. You know, you do share a trade agreement with Bithynia, but you can always break that. Actually, you have a non-aggression pact too, so I wouldn't break that right away, but just attack Sinope instead, kind of go down here and wipe out Bithynia at the end. Bithynia at Pontus will prove a relatively defensible province, and just in general will be pretty damn useful to you. Pretty useful. I think it's a great province to take. It's much more strategically viable than, you know, messing around with the Seleucids and the Ptolemaic dynasty. And while you're taking these provinces, this province, the alliance system of the Seleucids have in early game might unravel, and Lydia might desert them. And if that happens, then you can turn on Lydia without having to pay the price of invoking the Seleucids' wrath. So that's basically my early game strat. Take Bithynia at Pontus. You know, if you have done that, but like the Seleucid alliance system is still in place, you can turn your attention to Asia, I suppose, maybe. Or you could just go to Caucasia or something. There's like other options. If you want to be a little bit more extreme, you could just go up here and take the Bosphorus. It's a little bit far, but it's economically very, very good. And one of the easiest provinces to defend. But yeah, boys, that's my early game strategy. Now let's look at the buffs and debuffs that the Galatians have. Now, the Galatians have the same exact buffs that all of the Celtic factions have, or rather, I'd say the Gallic factions. They have +1 experience for all Gallic cavalry recruits, which is good, but for the Galatians, it's not very consequential because they don't have great cavalry by Gallic standards. Them and the Boii pretty much share like the worst cavalry when it comes to the Gauls, so yeah, you know, it's useful. Like, it would be useful for any faction, but it's not great. You also get increased population from temples when culture is dominant, and considering that you will be conquering provinces that are exclusively not Celtic, but is really useful, because you're going to be relying a lot on temples for public order. and long-term security for your provinces. So definitely this is going to come of use. Now, when it comes to your Galatian-specific buffs, you get increased captive income as well as increased income from raiding and sacking. And that is pretty good. Like, pretty much increased captive income means that whenever you win a battle and you ransom captives, or when you, like, take a city or something, you'll get, like, a little bit more. You'll get a little bit more. Now, raiding I don't tend to do in my campaigns very much, but I do know it's actually a reasonable source of income, especially when you're playing a barbarian faction. You don't have a lot of ways of making money, so it's one of the better ones. Now, the debuff you have is really annoying. It's increased construction time, and that is going to take it's going to take the form of every single building you want to build taking one additional turn. And that's just really, really annoying. It's one of the most annoying debuffs I've ever seen, because in Divide et Impera, it already takes a really long time to build buildings. In fact, in Rome 2 in general it does, but in Divide et Impera, I think that that's increased even more. So ultimately, that is a really annoying debuff, but at least it doesn't hurt your battle capabilities or anything like that. You just have to be a little bit patient, and you'll get over it. But yeah, that's all it is when it comes to the Galatians. Now let's look at the roster. Get into the real meat and potatoes of what it means to be a Galatian in Divide et Impera. Now the Galatians don't have a very large roster, so it shouldn't take a huge amount of time. Definitely it should be a little bit shorter than other factions, but amongst these limited tools, they do have some rather interesting ones, although not in all the right places. Now, when it comes to your general unit, you have the option of having this Galatian chosen swordsman. It is the best sword general that you're going to have in early game, because these guys come with the Nitos reforms in turn 90. So you're not going to get these guys right away. So if you want a sword general, you're going to have to go for the Galatian chosen swordsman. And frankly, that's a very, very good choice of general. This is a great sword unit for any time in the campaign. I mean, many, like, Celtic factions, like, for, say, the Boii at the very least, their elite swordsman has identical stats to this one, plus they just get, like, one javelin volley. So this is just such a combat-effective sword to have in early game. Definitely worth bringing. This is just a super-duper elite swordsman. It'll beat most swordsmen in the game, and there's really nothing else to say about it. Now, your other option is the Galatian Noble Spearman. This is a barbarian phalanx, a barbarian shield wall. I mean, this is a good version of his unit because it has 38 armor. A weaker one would have like 30 armor or 35 armor. So this is definitely a good version of this unit. Now, in the context of the Galatian roster, I just feel like you have so many effective melee infantry and spear infantry that you wouldn't really bring any phalanxes. Like, I wouldn't even really recommend bringing this unit, even though it's pretty good. This is honestly pretty decent. They're apparently supposed to be the backbone of the Galatian infantry line, but ultimately I just feel like when you have so many effective kind of loose-fitting units, there really isn't a reason to bring a kind of slow-moving, bulky, rigid unit like a phalanx. So I definitely wouldn't want to have your general here, specifically as like a barbarian faction too. It's just, a phalanx is ultimately pretty vulnerable because of her low speed. They need ample support to be effective. And I wouldn't really want my general to be a liability like that, so I wouldn't really bring him. Now for your next unit, once you get the Nitos reforms, you get this Galatian 4X infantry. They're just a direct upgrade on this chosen swordsman in several ways. They'll have more armor, more morale. They come with javelins. These ones don't have javelins. I think these guys also have a defensive formation too, which I don't really use these guys on swords. I just like my swords to kill as quickly as possible. But at the end of the day, once you get the Nitos reforms, you're just going to bring these guys instead of this. But yeah, for infantry generals, I just bring your swordsmen. For cavalry, you get either of these as an option. I believe that they're both available from the beginning of the campaign. I don't think one of these is Nitos reform. I might be wrong. You could definitely fact check me here, but I don't believe that any of your cavalry here is locked behind reforms. I think it's only a couple of infantry are, if I'm not mistaken. But anyways, when it comes to these two cavalry, they just play different roles. Like this Galatian noble cavalry, it's purely a melee cavalry. I mean, yes, with 40 charge bonus, they can still charge, don't get me wrong. Like any cavalry. The crappiest missile cavalry in the game, like the Greek javelin cavalry, could still, do some pretty terrible morale damage onto the enemy if they get a clean rear charge. So these guys will still do it, but their main competency is in melee combat, because 32 weapon damage is absolutely obscene for a cavalry unit. If these guys get in amongst cavalry but haven't charged them back, they will obliterate them in long-term combat. These guys are just like elite swordsmen that canter around on horses. They kind of know how to do it, but the real joy comes from swordsmanship. That's demonstrated in their stats. So this is definitely like a counter cavalry, but also this is a cavalry unit that can excel at like long-term combat in melee with infantry, which is pretty rare. Like most of the time when you charge a cavalry unit in, they'll just like die if you don't micro and pull them out. But these guys can actually stay in the fight and do really well because of that weapon damage. So keep that in mind. Their Galatian bodyguard is more of like a typical cavalry. You know, 50 charge bonus, yeah, pretty good. 38 armor, pretty good. But melee attack and melee defense aren't great. And, you know, honestly, like, if you take, like, the whole game of Rome 2, Divide et Impera, this is an okay cavalry unit, but in the context of, like, the Gallic factions, this is really not good. There's so many elite cavalry units that'll be, like, you know, 10 and 17 at the beginning of the game, and then their late game variants will be, like, 12 and 18 when it comes to melee defense. And they'll have, like, you know, pretty much the same armor and morale, but maybe, like, better weapon damage or charge slightly. It's just, this isn't great, but it's okay. This unit, kind of like a buffed up citizen cavalry. It's better than a citizen cavalry, don't get me wrong, but it's not significantly better. This one's just, like, okay. With Galatia, it's really like your cavalry options are a mixture of a relatively unique melee-centric cavalry here, a really mediocre normal cavalry unit, and really good swordsmen. If I were you, I'd probably pick the really good swordsman, unless you just really like having the cavalry general. Now, when it comes to your melee infantry are just straight-up goons. They are brawlers. They don't have the most shock value, if I'm going to be completely honest. Besides the axemen I'm looking at right now, they don't have a ton of shock value. But, you know, in a prolonged melee, not as prolonged as the Romans need, but in like, you know, a medium length prolonged melee, they'll slay. Now, your cheapest option are the Galatian swordsmen. You get this with Barrack number 2. And also, I should mind, there's very few reform units here, but I'll mention when I'm looking at a reform unit. But anyway, your Galatian swordsmen, you get them with Barrack level 2. They're okay. They're very cheap. They're very cost effective. But they don't charge amazingly. 19 charge bonus is just okay, but 28 weapon damage is really, really good for a unit of his caliber. Having 3 speed and 1 ammunition means that they're quite maneuverable, but that's at the cost of them being a light infantry unit. They won't survive cavalry charges particularly well, but you don't really expect a unit of his caliber to do so. They're just a solid melee infantry. Use these guys if you're trying to make a somewhat cheaper army. But, you know, if you're trying to bring a really good army, I wouldn't really rely on these guys as my backbone. They are somewhat unreliable. They're pretty easy to rout. Their morale isn't great. Their armor's only 10. So, at the end of the day, they're a little bit precarious. If you try to rely on these guys too much in your armies, you just won't do very well. And these guys are admittedly just freedmen. These are basically like farmers. Part-time warrior, part-time farmers. So, kind of explains why their stats as well as their armor are just mediocre. Now for your one true shock infantry unit, you have Galatian axemen. These guys are just a phenomenal axe unit. 14 melee armor penetration is really, really good. 30 armor is really, really good. I believe that these guys are as good as the Boii, who I mentioned, like they're the best. The Boii had the best mid-tier axe unit I've ever seen. No, I think the Boii one is slightly better. No, they're just identical. They're just straight up identical. They're the same unit. They just have a different unit card. They even cost exactly the same. So at the end of the day, like this is a very, very good axe unit. A supremely competent axe unit. Admittedly, axes are not something to be relied upon for your main line. For something that you bring 2 or 3 of, they provide excellent shock element on the flanks. You can also keep them behind your main line and kind of cycle them in and out. Really, really good, but not to be used by any circumstances as a main line. These guys are just to cleave the enemy main line apart and, of course, tear up their flanks. Now, this swordsman is really, really good. Again, recruitable of level 2 barracks, so relatively accessible. However, they do have the weakness of coming from your first population class, so your ability to recruit them is somewhat limited. You do have to be careful about recruiting them, because of course, from your first population class, I don't expect you're going to have like a full army of them unless, you know, you're just balling out for like one particular army. But these guys are just all class, absolutely elite, particularly in early game. When you'll get access to, they are unmatched. There's very, very, very few units that can compete with these guys. Of course, like good Romans can, and you know, top tier barbarian infantry sometimes can. A lot of them are worse than this one too. But they're just really, really solid, particularly in the region that you're in. They'll just be overpowered. So even though you can't get many of these guys, they will get like 200, 300 kills with ease if you use them correctly in the area you're in. Now with the Nito's reform, you get 2 more melee infantry units. So keep in mind, your entire melee roster is reduced to these 3 units until like turn 90. But at turn 90, you get these 2 units. Now the Galatian legionaries, they are worse than your Galatian chosen swordsmen. And less charge bonus, less weapon damage, less melee attack. Slightly more armor, but less morale. There's literally almost no reason why these Galatian legionaries are better. And yeah, we do have Romanesque formations. You know, you can make a Tescudo, you can make a hollow square, but I don't think that that's really all that important for an infantry unit, a melee infantry unit. You know, phalanxes rely on their formations. I don't think swordsmen really do. But where this unit is really, really good is that it's recruitable from your second population class. So if you need a sword unit that's a lot more accessible, this is where you're going to get them with your Galatian legionary. Still a phenomenal unit, but definitely worse than your typical Roman legionary too. Like especially at turn 90, you'd be fighting against Marian legionaries, and you know, I think I'd take a Marian legionary over this unit, to be honest with you. Definitely would take an Imperial legionary over this, no problem, no questions asked. Now Galatian 4X infantry are insanely good. They're better than the elite infantry of the Arverni. They're better than the elite infantry of the Boii. Truly a phenomenal unit, considering how limited the rest of the Galatian roster is. I think it's really fair, but they basically have the strongest Celtic swordsmen. So these guys are absolutely prime. Like, if you're looking for the best Celtic swordsman, this is it. You're staring right at it. You know, the Sakori one, arguable, but they're kind of different. They're more of like a shock sword. But amongst like the typical like Oathsworn adjacent units from Divide et Impera, this is the best one. It's very heavy, while most of the other ones are just heavy, and the 41 armor sets them apart from the others statistically. Amazing unit, really cool looking too. So just bring them in abundance. Now for your spears, I already covered with Galatian light spearmen. They are essentially a buffed up levy unit. It's really all they are. I think that they're statistically equivalent to his Gallic light spearmen, but I might be wrong about that. No, they have identical stats, identical costs. So yeah, they're just a typical barbarian levy that's just better than, you know, levies of other cultures. You know, barbarian levies do tend to be a bit better. It's kind of like this idea that because they do live a harder life, have a more warlike culture innately, you know, they're just typical farmer fighters would be better. But ultimately, these guys aren't like super duper good. Just in the region you're in, because you are going to be fighting against like Greek infantry and, you know, bad Eastern levies and stuff. These guys can do damage, but in a battle where you're actually fighting against an opponent of quality, you know, like an elite Seleucid army or something, you don't want to have these guys. They'll get so thoroughly outclassed. Like, these guys can outclass the worst units in the game, but they're not much. They definitely are very valuable. Now, your Galatian Furrow Spears, these guys are cool. You get them with the Illyrian reform, so turn 64. And they are better than Greek Phreo Spears. Like, just overall better. 25 armor, you know, that's really good. Most Phreo Spears have 20. But they also have better melee attack and better melee defense by 1. I think that's the main difference, actually. I think that the charge bonus as well as... No, but charge bonus is higher by 1, I believe. The charge bonus is higher by 1. But regular Phreo Spears are medium units, and these guys are very light. So that is a bit of a problem. They can get flattened by cavalry on the charge if they get a good charge. So they will be a little bit more vulnerable to cavalry, but they do have better combat stats than regular Freo spears, which are already pretty good. You know, if at turn 64 and above, you're looking for a unit that's capable of, like, helping you out on the flanks, and of course, take some of the cost burden off of you. You can't always afford the best units in your rosters, so, you know, if you have, like, a nice sword and axe core, and you're looking for something cheap on the flanks, you know, get a couple of Freo spears. These guys won't blow your mind, but they're pretty good. They're Galatian Naked Warriors. We already went over them abundantly on the campaign screen. Just really, really, really good fighting unit. And 4 ammunition means that they're also a hybrid skirmisher. This is by far the best naked spear type unit in Divide at Impera. I mean, just amazing charge bonus, weapon damage. For combat stats are amazing. Just remember, these guys do have low armor, so keep them out of range of enemy skirmishers, enemy skirmish cav. They do have that vulnerability, but if you can keep them out of danger, and then get them into combat, and of course cycle them in and out if you can. You don't leave them in prolong so that armor can become a liability. Just keep on using a charge bonus after they've thrown their ammunition as well. Getting those 4 javelins off will make these guys so much more lethal as well. But just a great unit. You know, in early game you're going to rely on these guys a lot. Once you get swordsmen and axemen, you know, as well as these Galatian swordsmen, I expect for you to use your Galatian naked warriors a little bit less. They end up becoming more of the type of unit that you bring 2 or 3 of, just for that shock value, that impact value, because they're not going to be the best mainline. Just, you know, an early game where you can kind of get away with it because everyone's armies are a little bit scuffed, you can use them, but moving on later you probably wouldn't. Now, your phalanx infantry is surprisingly hard to get because it's like near the end of your barrack chain. I think it's barrack level 3 or barrack level 4 actually. It takes a really long time for you to get these phalanxes. Now, we are good amongst Gallic phalanxes. Like 25 armor is really good. Like the Arverdi are the best Gallic phalanxes I've seen so far. And these Galatians, it looks like they're equivalent to the late Gallic shield wall spearmen. Considering that you don't have to wait for like Nito's reforms to get them, that's pretty damn good. But at the same time, I just wouldn't really bring these guys. Wouldn't really bring these guys if I were you. It just, I don't feel like they fit in that well into this roster. I just don't feel that they do. I just really don't think that they fit in that well into this roster. And that's really all I have to say about it. You know, when you have amazing melee swords, you have axes, you have a light sword, you have these type of spears, I wouldn't bring a phalanx. It just is going to restrict your movement so much. Like, you're going to end up having to fight in the typical style of, like, a Hellenic faction when you can be free, you can be flexible. But, of course, you don't have the cavalry pressure to do a hammer and anvil either. So, I'm just not a big fan of using phalanxes with this roster. I just feel like this good of a phalanx is kind of wasted on the Galatians, to be honest. Another reason, of course, is that you need to support your phalanx, and your missile infantry are horrible. You start out with these Galatian archers, which are your typical horrible Celtic archer, just atrocious unit, terrible unit. Don't bring these guys ever. There's no redeeming quality of this particular archer unit. Now, when it comes to your Galatian skirmishers, these guys are a hardcore skirmisher. And by that I mean this is the type of skirmisher that's going to do well at throwing javelins. 90 range is great, 22 missile damage is great. You can do better than that, but at the end of the day, this is a pretty cheap unit, so you shouldn't really expect that from the Galatians. But these guys don't have great melee combat stats, and that's just a limitation for me. I like my skirmishers to have good melee stats. I like to use them as hybrid units. I don't really value a pure javelin throwing javelin men, and that's what these guys are, so because of that I don't really rate them that highly. And your Galatian slingers are, you know, they're decent statistically. Like, we do have 190 range and 11 missile damage that's requisite of Celtic skirmishers. However, these guys don't have a shield. And considering your 1 armor, that just severely nerfs these guys, in my opinion. It means that these guys will die really quickly in a skirmish. So collectively, like, these 3 units just aren't good. And considering that you do have ammunition on a lot of your infantry, like besides your Galatian swords and these levies, you have ammunition on everyone, and you have 4 ammunition on your Galatian naked warriors, I just bring the naked warriors to help skirmish. And I feel like I just avoid bringing missile infantry because these options are so terrible. I just wouldn't do it. If you do conquer like roads or something like that, or just have access to good AOR skirmishers or mercenary skirmishers, I draw exclusively from them because your missile infantry roster is so bad. One of the worst in the game, if not the worst. Now for cavalry, not a ton to talk about. Start out with your Galatian medium cavalry. These guys are okay. They have medium in the name, but they're a light shot cavalry, which kind of pisses me off a little bit. Also, they're light, but they only have 7 speed, which also is kind of unnerving. Now, their combat stats are good and their charge bonus is decent, but 18 armor is bad. It just, at the end of the day, like, these guys aren't terrible, but the armor is a severe weakness of these guys, and the speed is just unnerving. This is just meant to be kind of mediocre. Like, they're usable. They have utility. But these statistics are clear evidence that the mod developers just don't want the Galatians to have good cavalry. That's supposed to be a weakness. For infantry is the main star. For cavalry it's just there, but it's worse than it's supposed to be. I'm going to skip the Cappadocian Lancers because these guys are an AOR unit. They're Galatian Noble Cavalries here, which actually means that this unit, this Galatian Bodyguard, general exclusive. You can't get them normally. But the Galatian Noble Bodyguard, already covered them before. This is exclusively like a cavalry that fights in prolonged combat because they have really good weapon damage, but really bad charge for like a heavy elite cavalry. Very similar to the Aspis Companion Cavalry in base game, but these guys are good for what they are, but they serve a very specific purpose, and it's a bit of an odd purpose. And considering that these two are really your main cavalry options, you're kind of stuck between like two weird units, like a really, really kind of mediocre medium cavalry, quote unquote medium cavalry, and then kind of a weird noble cavalry. It's not a whole lot, but I bring the noble cavalry if I can. Of course, you're expending your population, your first class population, which admittedly you should be saving those guys for your swords. So weirdly enough, between these two options, I almost feel like it's prudent just to, again, rely on mercenaries and rely on AOR units. Like, this Galatian Noble Cavalry is viable, but you don't want to waste your first-class population. And this Galatian Medium Cavalry is just really mediocre, barely worth bringing. Now, you also have Galatian Light Cavalry. These guys are available from turn 1. And to be fair, for, like, an early game, like, turn 1 skirmish cavalry, which is usually terrible, these guys are actually okay. They do 12 melee armor penetrating damage, which is a bit of like a hidden stat. And then 10 melee attack and 8 melee defense is actually better than a lot of javelin cavalry have. Like these guys, this one is way better than the Greek variation of this. So I'm almost tempted to advise that you just bring these guys because they're an interesting hybrid, but simultaneously it's still a light cavalry unit with 90 men. 36 base morale and 11 armor, meaning these guys are going to drop like flies when you use them, man. Like flies. Like, these guys absolutely are not going to have the capability to last long in combat if you charge them in, and that makes the armor penetrating damage a little bit negligible. So, I don't know. Again, kind of a wimpy unit, kind of a questionable unit, but definitely one of the more interesting light skirmish cavalries I've seen in Divide et Impera. Like, I've seen many examples, like Syracusan, Sicilian cavalry and stuff. Like, examples of the Divide et Impera team trying to make, like, a viable kind of skirmish light cavalry. Just kind of like a hybrid. If these guys will do, like, really well against skirmishers and stuff like that because of these stats, but against anything besides light infantry, don't hold your breath. These guys will just get outclassed and quickly routed. Now for chariots, you have two options for chariots. I don't really like chariots in general. I feel like it requires the AI being really stupid for you to make use of them, which frequently does happen, but still. Just considering like the roster that you have, I don't feel like you can provide ample support for these chariots, and they'll probably just get wrecked. You also have access to these Galatian chariots, which are like the Celtic style chariot. They're very similar to the type of chariots that the Britain factions are going to have. But I just don't think that these guys are very good. Like, they're very light, very low health. Get killed very easily by almost anything. So I wouldn't really bring these guys. I just don't rate them particularly highly. I think they're just too much of a volatile unit to easily make use of. And very expensive, mind you. Like, all chariots are very, very expensive in this game. Akin to, like, your best cavalry units in terms of price, or more expensive. Galatian Scythe Chariot will definitely fall into the more expensive category. Now, if you're going to bring a chariot, you're going to bring this chariot unit. It is a really decent kind of, like, game-winning unit. X-Factor unit. They're just insanely expensive, and they are a risk. You know, they can get countered pretty sufficiently by, you know, javelins, skirmishers, heavy cavalry, phalanxes. You know, if you don't use them right and don't support them amply, they're not going to do great. And to be honest, I just don't feel like this is the type of unit, this is the type of roster I'd want to, like, bring chariots with. I just feel like they're too much of a risk. You're going to sink too many resources into them, and, like, at the end of the day, you don't have the most tools to keep them safe either. I wouldn't really bring them, which is my advice, but this is a very competent chariot unit. If you're a fan of chariots, bring Galatian Scythe Chariots. They'll do you proud. But that's it when it comes to his roster. It's really not that big of one. In terms of your strengths, obviously it's your melee infantry and some of your spears, like these Frail Spears and these Naked Warriors are good options, although the Naked Warriors are like an insane one. The Frail Spears here are just solid. The rest sucks. Because of that, I do have to give them a kind of low score. I mean, I'm never going to give, like, a faction with an insane unit like Galatian 4-axe infantry, like, a super low score. But I'm going to give these guys a 4 out of 10. Below average. Just about below average. Because I can't give a faction with such, like, limitations when it comes to roster building a great grade. Like, literally all that they have is cost-effective swords, a decent shock unit of a Galatian axemen, good competent swordsmen, and a couple okay spearmen. Like, that's just not good enough to make a faction. Feels like almost like half of a faction. Like, you have like half of a really good faction, but the other half is like a monstrosity. That's what the Galatians are. They are truly a monstrosity. People of Asia Minor certainly thought so. So that's for power rating. In terms of how much you should play this campaign, though, it's a weirdly cool campaign. It's a very unique campaign. You're just a marauding barbarian horde streaming through Asia Minor. You don't belong there at all. There's like no Celtic factions around you at all. No one wants to be your friend. I don't think in my, like, campaign map overview I even went over diplomacy, because it just doesn't matter. As long as you stay out of wars with the Seleucids, it does not matter whatsoever. You're not going to make extensive friendships there. That's just kind of cool. It is cool to have this type of infantry in a region so devoid of high quality infantry too. Because of that, I feel like this is a campaign you should try. It's just oddly cool. It interested me. It had a charm. I'm going to give the campaign a solid 7 out of 10 in terms of how much you should play. You should give the Galatians a try. Maybe you don't have to play the whole campaign, but the start is really fun and really cool. Using a lot of Naked Spears just feels so derpy. It's just a fun one. It's a bit of a meme too, but it's a fun one. Now, in terms of difficulty, I would say that the Galatian campaign is kind of easy at the beginning. As long as you can figure out the finances, you can win battles left and right just because of your superior quality infantry. Just plain, you'll just outclass your opponents. But in late game, you will struggle. You will really, really struggle in late game. You just don't really have the tools to beat, like, powerhouse factions once they unlock for reform units. So I feel because of that, you know, I feel like in terms of difficulty, I'll give it a 6.5 out of 10. It's not an insanely difficult campaign because you can amass a lot of territory at the beginning. You do have solid infantry that'll help you out, and once you know you get a couple of provinces under your belt, you can get mercenaries and AOR units to flush out the rest of your roster. It's not an insanely difficult campaign by any means. It's not like a nightmare campaign, but it's not easy either, so I think 6.5 reflects that pretty well. But that's it when it comes to the Galatians. They're a cool faction. They're a brawly faction. They are, by far, one of the most unique factions I've covered so far, just in terms of how they play and in terms of how the campaign feels. It's not like the roster is insanely unique or anything, but so when you put all of this together, it offers a unique challenge. So try the Galatians out. And that's it when it comes to this guide. Definitely a cool faction, and amongst the Celts, it's definitely an outlier. But yep, that's all for now. See you in the next video. Bye.